Trailblazer fans, and welcome to The Briefcase, episode 100 of The Briefcase, a special draft edition of The Briefcase, a video draft edition of The Briefcase. We're blowing it out here for the 100th episode of The Briefcase. I'm your host, Casey Holdahl, and as you're probably well aware, the Portland Trailblazers are preparing for this week's draft. First round on Wednesday, second round on Thursday. Portland Trailblazers with the 7th, 14th, 34th, and 40th picks in the upcoming draft have spent the last 2 months plus figuring out what they're going to do with those 4 picks, bringing in players for workouts, conducting intel, scouting, all the things you do to get yourself ready when you're on the clock to make those picks. So on this edition of The Briefcase, we're going to get you prepared for the draft, which this year, first round is on Wednesday, 5 o'clock, ESPN. Second round the next day on Thursday, 1 o'clock, ESPN. So we'll look at a little bit of draft history, both for the Trailblazers and for the league in general, look at the history of the 7th and the 14th picks, and then get into the players that Portland has brought in for workouts or players that might be available when Trailblazers are on the clock at the 7th and 14th picks. So let's go ahead and get started on this edition of The Briefcase. Well, first off, let's just go ahead and talk a little bit about the Portland Trailblazers and their recent draft history. Now, granted, what the Trailblazers did last year or the year before doesn't necessarily have a whole lot of impact on what they're going to do in 2024, but it's always worth knowing generally the way that teams conduct their business, so that way when things happen, you can generally understand like, okay, I've seen that before, or oh, I know where they're coming from here. That's not to say they're not going to change up, that's not to say they won't do things differently. Every single draft presents a different challenge, and I think this draft, more than other drafts, is probably the case, just considering on how little agreement there seems to be about which players should be going where. So you really have to be on your P's and Q's in terms of your scouting and what you value, because what you value might not necessarily be with another team values. And a lot of times, I think when it comes to the draft, teams generally maybe look to see what other teams are doing and then base their boards somewhat on that. This year, I don't really think that's the case. There's so much different talent in this draft, and there's just not that top level talent. At least the presumption is there isn't that top level talent in this draft that kind of feeds into the rest of the draft. And what I mean by that is when you have 2, 3, 4 players who are all generally considered to be the best players in that draft, that kind of filters down to all the other draft boards. This year, though, there doesn't seem to be a whole lot of consensus about who is going to be in the top 5, really even the top 1 or 2. So this year, I feel like those draft boards can be quite a bit different from one team to the next team. And there's always some kind of variance, but I think this year, probably more than other years, there's going to be more variance. And because of that lack of consensus, I think it's really important to consider what each individual team has generally done in drafts, especially when it comes to the current front offices. So let's go ahead and see what the Portland Trailblazers have done over the last 5 years in terms of their picks and their trades at the draft. The last 5 years covers Joe Cronin's time as Portland's general manager, and even a little bit before that. And 5 years feels like it gives us at least a decent idea of what the team has done generally over the last half decade in terms of their draft night preparation. And obviously Joe Cronin was on the staff prior to that as well, so you also get a pretty good sense of the way that Joe considers things, or the way that things have operated when Joe Cronin has been in Portland's front office. So here it goes. In the last 5 years, Portland Trailblazers have drafted 10 players, 6 in the first round and 4 in the second round. Of those 10 players, 8 have ended up playing for the Portland Trailblazers. Those would be Anthony Simons, Nasir Little, CJ Ellaby, Shaedon Sharpe, Jabari Walker, Scoot Henderson, Chris Murray, and Ron Rupert. Almost all those players are still on the team, by the way, just Nas Little and CJ Ellaby, the only players who aren't on the team who the Portland Trailblazers have drafted in the last 5 years. Kind of interesting. As for the 2 players who Portland selected who were then traded, Portland selected Isaiah Stewart with the 16th pick of the 2020 draft before trading him, along with Trevor Ariza and a 2021 first-round pick, to the Houston Rockets in exchange for Robert Covington. And then in 2022, Portland selected Gabriel Procida with a 36th pick before trading him a 2025 first-round pick, a 2025 second-round pick, and a 2026 second-round pick to the Detroit Pistons in exchange for Jeremy Grant and Ishmael Kamagate. Jeremy Grant obviously still on the team as well. So over the last 5 years, not a lot of recent history with regard to draft night trades for the Trailblazers. However, they did execute 6 trades between the 2013, 2015, and 2017 draft. So in the last 5 years, they've executed a lot fewer trades on draft night than they executed in the previous 5 years. That also makes quite a bit of sense too when you consider where the Trailblazers are at right now, what they've been doing for the last couple seasons in terms of trying to build a team going forward, whereas the 5 seasons before that, they were trying to add to a team that they felt like was already ready to compete. So that makes a little bit of sense why those numbers would be different. But I also think, too, it comes down to deal flow and whether or not there's good offers made available on draft night, or if you're, as a team, able to get other teams to bite on some of your draft ideas. Another thing that is worth considering, and is probably actually more important than what they've done in the past, is the current players that they have on the roster. So Portland does have 4 draft picks, but they also have 13 players currently under contract for next season, and that'll be 14 players if they decide to pick up Delano Banton's option. So bringing in 4 players does seem somewhat unlikely if they don't make any other moves. However, it's worth remembering that they also have 2 two-way contracts, so while a trade, even one that flips a current pick for a future pick, seems somewhat likely, it's not exactly guaranteed, seeing as how you now have 13 players under contract, potentially 14 players if they pick up Delano Banton's option. So that's 1 open roster spot, and then 2 open two-way spots, and that says nothing of whether or not they might actually execute trades before the draft, or sometime after the draft, or what they might do in free agency. And always worth remembering, too, that the draft is just one way to acquire players. There's obviously also trades and free agency, and those things typically come later on in the offseason. So what they do at the draft, or the team as constructed after the draft, not necessarily going to be the team that is going to take the floor opening night for the 2024-25 season. While in general, I don't think that needs are really the right way to look at the draft, I'm very much a proponent of picking the best player available. It's always worth at least considering what the current roster has, because there are some times where if things are close, maybe you go with positionality over best player available. In this draft, I think there's probably more argument for that as well, because again, I don't know if there's a whole lot of agreement between one team to the next about which player is better than the other. I think that really comes down to what each team prefers. So in this draft, maybe it's a little more important than other drafts, but even so, I think generally, particularly when it comes to 7 and 14, the team's going to take which players they feel like are the best players, not necessarily which ones are the players who might fit at the positions that the Portland Trail Blazers need the most. So let's go ahead and consider what are some of the things that maybe the Portland Trail Blazers need. When you consider some of the skills that this team could probably still add, there are really a lot of the skills that every team could add, and I think that's really kind of the first thing you need to consider when it comes to talking about what the Portland Trail Blazers need. At this point in time, they just need talent. They need players that can come in and can compete at a high level and become parts of this team going forward. The Trailblazers next season, and probably the season after that, are still more in the talent acquisition mode, more in building their team, building their roster, building their culture. And so what is going to result in wins from a night-to-night basis at this point, probably not more important than what is going to give this team the best chance to compete for a championship in 3 years. And so when you're talking about what this team needs, it is a bit hard to tell at this point what they're going to need when you're really ready to start competing for the playoffs and for a championship. And so because of that, it just makes the most sense to take the players who you feel have the most talent, which I think obviously at 7 and 14, that is something they're going to prioritize. But if they decide to go in more the direction of what are some of the things we need, which I think when you get to the second round, that's when you start considering those things a little bit more. Or if you have a chance to trade down, perhaps, maybe those are the kind of things you consider if there's not players at your pick that you think are really worth the trouble. So some of the things the Portland Trailblazers could use are three-point shooting. Again, every team needs three-point shooting. Portland Trailblazers, one of the worst three-point shooting teams last year. They could definitely use an upgrade at shooting, particularly on the wing. The three-point shot is obviously incredibly important in today's NBA, and the Trailblazers could use a few more guys out there who are more likely to hit at a better clip than they did at least last season. Perimeter defense, or really any defense, again, because of the team that has struggled on the defensive end for some time, something they could also use as well. Once again, if they decide to prioritize specific skills over just who the best player is. And obviously, that is a debate too. What makes for a best player is not necessarily going to be the same from one team to the next. It's not like any of these things are hard and fast rules. So it is figuring out what works best for you, what your scouts like, what your team likes, what your coaching staff likes, and then going from there. One other thing I think the Portland Trailblazers could use as well is secondary playmaking. Having multiple ball handlers on the team is something, again, that's been an issue for this team for some time. They've always generally had good ball handling guards, but having players at the 3, the 4, and even the 5 that can take some of the pressure off in terms of creating offense, that's something the Trailblazers could absolutely use. If there's players in this draft that they feel like could be good secondary playmakers for this team, I'm guessing that's something they would also consider as well if they decide to go with more skills and positionality when they're on the clock rather than just taking BPA. All right, well, let's do a quick recap of the recent history of 7th and 14th picks in the NBA draft. In 2023, Bilal Coulibaly went 7th and Jordan Hawkins went 14th. In 2022, as you probably know, Shaedon Sharpe went 7th. Pretty good pick there. And Ochai Agbaji went 14th. 2023, Jonathan Kuminga and Moses Moody, both to Golden State, by the way, went 7th and 14th. So the Trailblazers are in a very similar situation, or actually, in fact, the exact same situation that Golden State was in 2023 when they took Kuminga and Moses Moody. Two pretty good picks there, I'd say. 2022, Killian Hayes and Aaron Nesmith went 7th and 14th. Killian Hayes no longer in the league, or at least I don't think he is, or at least he got cut from the Pistons. So not exactly probably something you want to emulate there with the 7th overall pick. Aaron Nesmith, though, nice little player. And then 2021, Kobe White and Romeo Langford went 7th and 14th. So good, but not great in terms of the players recently who've been taken with 7 and 14, though it's probably a little bit too early on some of those guys to say whether or not they're going to be good or great players. In fact, the guys in the last 3 drafts, you probably need to at least give guys 4 or 5 years to figure out what they're going to be, particularly with how young players are when they come into the league these days. So you really can't judge a draft until 3, 4, 5 years down the line. But in general, 7th and 14th picks, good players, not a whole lot of great players, at least not yet. However, if you go just a little further back, some pretty good 7th picks. In 2017, you had Lauri Markkanen, very good pick. 2016, Jamal Murray, excellent pick. 2014, Julius Randle, very good pick. 2012, Harrison Barnes, not bad at all. And then 2009, Steph Curry went 7th, probably the best 7th pick of all time. And then at 14, it obviously depends on what year it is, but you're probably looking at more very good role players at 14, obviously at the very end of some semi-recent 14th picks of note. Michael Porter Jr. went 14th in 2020, and he only went 14th because of his back. If he had not had those injury issues, he probably goes top 5. Obviously, he's worked out pretty well for the Denver Nuggets. And then in 2017, Bam Adebayo, another very good 14th pick. If you get a player like Bam Adebayo at 14, you knocked it out of the park. All right, now let's get to the players that Portland did work out, either privately or publicly, and consider some of the players they might be considering when they're on the clock at both 7 and 14. Worth pointing out here, too, that of the players I mentioned the Trailblazers drafted, the last 5 years, they've selected 8 players that have been on their team. I think every single one of those players participated in a draft workout with the Portland Trailblazers. So if there's one good indication of whether or not the Blazers are or are not going to take a player, it's whether or not they worked out for the Trailblazers, which seems kind of obvious, but a lot of times, you bring in a lot of different players for workouts. You bring in so many different players for workouts that it kind of gets lost in the shuffle sometimes who you brought in, who you didn't bring in. And these days, too, with so many teams keeping something secret, sometimes it's a bit hard to tell if a guy has worked out until after the fact. But in general, the Portland Trailblazers have been a team throughout the years where the players that they pick, particularly in the first round, are generally players who have come through Portland for workouts. So let's go ahead and look at the players who have come through Portland during the 2024. By my count, the Trailblazers held 7 public workouts with 37 players. They also had multiple private workouts, which reporting would seem to indicate were some of their best workouts in terms of first-round talent, or at least the amount of players expected to go in the first round who came in for workouts. Generally, those private ones seem like they've been some of the better workouts. Those are generally the players that request private workouts. And this year, with there not being a whole lot of consensus about which players are actually the best players, I think there was more of an impetus for players to participate in public workouts. Whereas in other drafts, I feel like if you're about a top 10 guy, a lot of times those guys only work out privately, or at least solo workouts. Blazers holding a number of private workouts, both solo and group workouts. So really a little bit of everything for the Trailblazers this year in terms of their 2024 draft preparation, which makes some sense because they have 4 picks. And it's a draft where, again, there's just not a whole lot of agreement about which players are the actual best players, are going to be the best players when all these guys come to their own. So once again, the Blazers held 7 public workouts with 37 players, and I count roughly 8 players who participated in public workouts with the Trailblazers who are likely to go in the first round. But Dalton Knecht is the only player who came through Portland for a public workout who seems likely to go in the top 10. In terms of those private workouts, we basically have to go off what some of the reporting has been. And generally, I think you can pretty much trust that reporting. Everyone usually knows where everyone else has worked out for. They may not want to broadcast it, but I'm guessing all 30 teams generally have a pretty good idea about where all the players expected to take in, at least in the lottery, have worked out during this pre-draft process. And when it comes to the Trailblazers, private workouts of note included Donovan Clingan, Cody Williams, Matas Buzelis, and the 6-player workout, which featured Ron Holland, John Salon, Ryan Dunn, Zach Edey, Yves Missy, and Kaishan George. And the players who reportedly came through Portland for private workouts include Donovan Clingan, Cody Williams, Matas Buzelis, and the 6-player workout, which featured Ron Holland, John Salon, Ryan Dunn, Zach Edey, Yves Missy, and Kaishan George. Again, those had reportedly happened, and I know from time to time, those things do get confused about who did come in when. I know there was a little bit of misinformation, at least in this draft process, about players who would come through Portland, or at least the timing of when they came through Portland. But generally, if someone says, yes, that guy worked out for a team, even if the team didn't announce it, it's generally safe to assume that that actually did happen. And of the players that we either know or that reportedly came through Portland, it seems like Clingan, Williams, Buzelis, Holland, and according to recent rumors at least, Eder are all options at 7, while Salon, Dunn, Missy, and George are all likely options at 14. Same goes for Jared McCain, Khalil Ware, Kyle Filipowski, Tristan D Silva, and Cam Christie, all who are conceivable options in terms of players who had public workouts for the Trailblazers who might go around 14. That might be a little high for some of those players, might be even a little low for some of those players, but again, in this draft, with still little consensus, it really comes down to what you like more. So if you're the Trailblazers this year, I think it's very possible that there might be players at 14 that you like, that you would take at 14, that maybe another team wouldn't take at 14. And vice versa. Again, there's just not a whole lot of consensus about a lot of these picks. If you go around the mock drafts, there's basically guys at different spots everywhere out of the top 3, top 4. And generally, mock drafts are not the best way to go about these things, considering if you go back and look at some of those mock drafts, they don't actually have a very good hit rate, but they are good indications of what teams are telling people. It might not be actual information that's true, but it is an indication of what they're saying. And in this draft specifically, I wouldn't be surprised if any of the players who are expected to go in the first round, who worked out for the Trailblazers, end up going at 7 or 14. Because again, I just don't think there's going to be that much agreement from one team to the next about which players are best. So if a player comes into a workout and does well, he might move up another team's board, whereas if he has a bad workout with another team, maybe he's down on their board. There's not a whole lot of information to base some of those things on. So I think this could be a year where, again, there's a lot of variance, and any of those players who've come through Portland for workouts who are expected to be taken in the first round, they could go at 7, they could go at 14, and none of them will really surprise me. There are obviously players who I think are more likely to go at 7 or 14, but if you were going to tell me that any of the guys who came through Portland for workouts were going to go with either one of those 2 first-round picks, I wouldn't be surprised. And while it's never particularly easy to project out to the second round, in this year's draft, it's almost impossible to project out to the second round, in my personal opinion. There are plenty of options at 34 and 40. The second round, particularly in this draft, is really where I think teams probably go about dressing some of their team needs more than which players they think might end up being best. Because again, once you're getting down to 34 and 40th, really hard to tell at that point in time what is going to pan out. You just got to take a player that does the things that you feel like you like, that works well for your team, and live with the results. All right, with all that said, let's go ahead and dig a little bit deeper into some of the players that the Portland Trailblazers might be interested in selecting with the 7th and 14th picks. All right, with all that said, let's go ahead and go a little bit deeper about some of the players, some of whom have come through Portland, some of whom have not come through Portland, who the Trailblazers might be interested in selecting with the 7th and 14th picks. We'll start with the guards. First off, Shepard, a guy who seems like he probably won't be available by the time Portland's on the clock at 7. As I just mentioned, it's a bit difficult to game out this draft, if you ask me. A guy like Shepard, even though it seems like he's probably going to go in the top 5, who's to say something didn't happen on draft night? He is a guy who is the definition of a two-way player, elite shooting, elite defense, shot better than 50% from both the field and from 3 during his one season at Kentucky, shot 52% if I'm not mistaken from 3, which is absolutely ridiculous. Won Freshman of the Year from multiple organizations. A guy who, when you look at him, 6'3", not exactly a huge guy. You expect, boy, this guy just must be a shooter. A guy who very good on the defensive end, both on the ball and off the ball. Averaged 2.5 steals during his one season at Kentucky. Now, granted, steals not always the best way to tell how good of a defender someone is, but a guy who absolutely makes his bones on the defensive end, not just a shooter, a guy who gives you elite 3 and D possibilities, and probably even more than that too. But as I mentioned, probably off the board by the time Trailblazers are picking at 7th. And I don't know if he's necessarily a guy who you move up to get when you already have Anthony Simons, Scoot Henderson, and Shaedon Sharpe on your team. And that's something I probably should have mentioned as well. The best player available really comes down to when you're on the clock. Just because there's a better player available does not necessarily mean you go and get that guy by executing trades. It's more about who's the best player available at your pick when you're on the clock, not who's the best player available in this draft and what will we have to do to get to that slot. Obviously, if you like a guy a lot, there's a whole lot of things you can do trade-wise, but it might not always be the wisest thing to do. We'll have to see on draft night. Next up, Devin Carter. Do everything combo guard, a guy who I think is going to really excel in the NBA. If you can defend and shoot in the NBA, you're going to do a great job. And he's a guy who can defend and shoot, plays with a lot of poise, plays with a lot of intensity. He's 6'3" and averaged 8.7 rebounds last season. He averaged more rebounds in the Big East than Donovan Clingan averaged in the Big East as a 6'3" guard. That should tell you something about this guy's want to. Devin Carter, a guy who is going to be a fan favorite wherever he goes. impacts the game on both sides of the ball as a great shooter and an absolute phenomenal defender, can defend multiple positions, something that every single team in the NBA is clamoring for, is guys who can switch, particularly on the perimeter and guard 1, 2, 3, perhaps even as much as 4. It's a little bit small to guard 4s, but a guy who can at least hold his own if he gets switched off in the post. NBA 4 is not exactly the same size they used to be anyways, so very good undersized defenders in the modern NBA can sometimes go 1 through 4. Not super common, but it does happen. As far as I know, neither Shepard nor Devin Carter came through Portland for workouts. One player who did come through Portland for a workout, solo workout, Connect. Once again, another guy who is a knockdown three-point shooter, 40% of his attempts at Tennessee, a guy who started in junior college, then moved to Northern Colorado, declared for the draft, got feedback saying, look, man, you're going to have to show you can actually do this against better competition. Went to Tennessee for his final year, SEC Player of the Year, and actually played better against better competition than he did in lower competition, which is one of the reasons I think Connect is now very likely to go in the top 10 of this draft. A guy who can shoot off the dribble and attack closeouts, which is incredibly important. If you're a three-point shooter, it's not enough to just be a three-point shooter. You have to be a three-point shooter. You can also put the ball on the floor a little bit. That way you can actually use the threat of your three-point shooting to create shots for yourself and for your teammates. Don't Connect, a guy who can absolutely do that. Also a guy who can probably play the 2 or the 3 in the NBA, a guy who, again, on the wing, gives you shooting, has an ability to defend as well. Finished off his college career with an Elite 8 run with Tennessee while also being a first-team All-American. If you win first-team All-American after coming out of a junior college for your first 2 years, you're a guy who's improved your game considerably. Don't Connect, a guy who has worked his way from a guy who probably wouldn't have gotten drafted last year to a guy that's going to be potentially a lottery pick this year, actually a guaranteed lottery pick this year. And then on the other end of the spectrum from Dalton Connect is a guy like Jared McCain, an efficient volume three-point shooter in his 1 season at Duke, creates opportunities for himself and for others in transition, is also another great rebounder for his size and for his position. He's an unselfish passer, combo guard probably in the NBA, played most of his time off the ball at Duke, probably a guy who's going to have to play some on the ball in the NBA. He's better off the ball at this point in time, but as young as he is, I'm sure that being on the ball in the NBA is something that he's probably going to be able to do. And particularly considering how good of a pick and roll ball handler he is, you probably are going to want him on the ball a little bit more in the NBA than maybe he was at Duke. And again, he offers something the Portland Trailblazers need, which is shooting. Shot 41% from 3 in his 1 season at Duke on nearly 6 attempts per game. But not just shooter, he's also a great rebounder, which is another area the Trailblazers have had issues with for the last couple seasons. Having guards who can come in and rebound, take some of the load off their bigs is definitely something this team could use. He's a great secondary playmaker. He's engaged. He's intelligent. He talked about being a curious person when he came through his workout in Portland. Dalton Connect and Jared McCain both came through Portland for workouts. Dalton Connect, solo workout. Jared McCain, group workout. Another guard who came through Portland for a workout, Cam Christie, a guy who phenomenal shooter at Minnesota his first season. 7 or 14 probably seems a little bit high for where he's projected to go at this point in time. But again, neither would surprise me. I'd be a little surprised actually if he got taken at 7th. 14th seems like a possibility for Cam Christie. I'm guessing that's probably not going to be the case, but he did come through Portland for a workout. And if he falls to 34, which probably is more unlikely than him getting picked at 7th, but if he did fall to 34, that'd be an interesting pick for the Trailblazers. Now on to some of the wing players that the Trailblazers might be considering with their 7th and 14th picks. Again, I think the wing is where Portland could probably use the most help, but it doesn't necessarily mean those are the players they're going to take. 7 and 14, I'm picking best player available. If it happens to be a wing, I think they'd love that. If it's not, I think they'd be okay taking that player as well and addressing that somewhere else, either later on in the draft or perhaps in free agency or maybe even with a trade. But with that said, let's go ahead and look at some of the wings that the Portland Trailblazers might be interested in at the 2024 draft. First off, Ron Holland, a guy who one of the best players in his high school class, went and played for the G League Ignite. Didn't have the season at the Ignite that I think he would have liked. Really, no one at the G League Ignite seemed like they had the season they would have liked, which is why they folded up shop, I'm imagining, at the end of the season. But a guy who, if he's available at 7, he's obviously an elite athlete. A lot of his highlights show him out in transition, a phenomenal athlete. The Portland Trailblazers could use more athleticism on the wing for a couple seasons now, so a guy like Ron Holland really gives you that. A guy who could end up being an elite defensive player in the NBA after averaging 2.1 steals and 1.1 blocks for the Ignite last season. One of the youngest players in the 2024 draft as well, so a guy who still has a lot of room to grow. And again, you're talking about 18, 19-year-olds who are playing professionally for their first time, away from home for their first time. I don't know how harshly you can judge them by what they did with the G League Ignite. I know Ron Holland also had an injury issue as well. So once again, not entirely sure how much you can look at what he did this season and say that this is or isn't the player that he is or is not going to be. At 6'8", 205 pounds, gives you exactly what you want at that position. 2, 3, perhaps even having the ability to play some stretch 4. He's one of those guys where you see the athleticism, you see his skills, you see the motor, and you instantly start thinking about how he could play on an NBA team. He's the exact kind of guy who fits that prototypical wing player in the NBA. Great at finishing at the rim, needs to become a better shooter. Not exactly uncommon for guys of that age, particularly guys who are wild athletic. Generally, the shooting comes along a little bit later because they're usually able to get to the rim, and that's something that I know the Blazers would like players to do anyways. Chauncey Billups is definitely a coach who likes his players to get their feet in the paint rather than deferring for the first three-point shot. Ron Holland, a guy who's definitely going to try to get his feet in the paint, finish at, over, and around you, rather than relying on his three-point shot. And as mentioned, at least reportedly, Ron Holland did come through Portland for a workout as part of that big group workout that they had a few weeks ago. Then there's Cody Williams out of Colorado, who reportedly had a solo workout with the Trailblazers. Lanky, playmaking forward, younger brother of Jalen Williams with the Oklahoma City Thunder. Obviously, if it ends up turning out anything like Jalen Williams, that's a home run pick at 7. Great feel for the game, great understanding of pace and space. Again, another guy who probably didn't do exactly what he'd have liked to do in his one season at Colorado, but he still shot better than 55% from the field and 41% from 3, which you'll take that on your team any day of the week. He's one of those guys, too, where it's just super easy to visualize him on an NBA team. Obviously, having a brother who's already a very good NBA player helps with that a little bit, but he's 6'8", 7-foot wingspan, prototypical NBA wing size, a guy who can shoot, who can defend, guy who can finish at the rim as well. And I think Williams is a guy, too, where if you look at Portland's roster, he probably fits in better in terms of positionality than some of the other options. Again, it's going to come down to whether or not he's the best player available when the Blazers are on the clock at either 7 or 14, but he's very easy to see how you could go ahead and plug him in right away going forward for this Trailblazer team as a young wing to pair up with the guys you already have on the team in Shaedon Sharpe and Scoot Henderson. And I mentioned this previously, the Trailblazers seem like they've more deferred to having guards and bigs come through for workouts, so not a whole lot of guys who I would call wings came through Portland for workouts. Other guys who did, though, Jalen Tyson of Cal, a guy who really gives you kind of a little bit of everything, a ball-handling 6'7" guard forward kind of player. Again, 7'14" seems a little bit high for him, but a guy who came through Portland for a workout, reportedly did a very nice job. A guy with a little bit of Brandon Roy to his game, I would say. You know, not someone who's going to blow you over with athleticism, but a guy who knows how to play the game, can shoot, knows how to get to his spots on the floor, and has that size to where you can play the 1, the 2, or the 3. Kaishan George of Miami also came through Portland supposedly for that private workout. Same with Ryan Dunn. Both those players, guys who defensively, Portland could really use what they have to offer. Length, they're both young. Dunn, a guy who seems like he's shooting up draft boards, I think was initially a second-round guy, has maybe worked his way into the middle of the first round. Kaishan George, a guy who out of Miami. George, both a good shooter and a good secondary playmaker, both things Trailblazers could absolutely use. Has great size for position as well, long arms, a guy who could probably become a very good defender in the NBA. Another guy who's super young, a guy who wasn't expected necessarily to be a one-and-done guy, ended up playing well at Miami, worked his way into a first-round pick, likely to go probably sometime after 14. But again, I think the Blazers like you. They're going to take you with one of their picks. They're not going to necessarily try to fool around and maybe try to trade back in hopes that you're still going to be on the board. In this draft, if you like a guy, take him. And finally, we come to the bigs, which Trailblazers worked out quite a few bigs throughout the pre-draft process. And I think that really just speaks to the fact that there just have to be more good big men in this draft than there are wings and guards. Not necessarily the Blazers are looking for a center, but if the best player available when Portland's on the clock is a center, I believe they're going to take that player, even though they already have DeAndre Jordan and Robert Williams III, both very good players at their positions, players that the Blazers absolutely love. But it's best player available, and so if one of these guys is the best player when Portland's on the clock, I think they're going to take that guy regardless of who else is already on the team. So let's go ahead and look at some of the bigs who Portland might be interested in at 7 or 14, particularly guys who came through Portland. Donovan Clingan, obviously UConn back-to-back 2-time national champion, obviously an elite rim protector, and a guy who can probably actually guard out a little bit on the perimeter as well. Granted, he's huge, 7 foot. He's not going to be a guy who's necessarily going to be able to contain guards on the perimeter, but he's going to be able to hold things in check a little bit better than I think people might assume he can. If you're one of those people that doesn't like the idea of centers shooting threes, Donovan Clingan and Zach Eder are your kind of guys. Neither one of those guys really three-point threats. There's some talk that Clingan shot threes in high school, but he basically took none in college, and I think he's like a 50-something% free throw shooter, so I wouldn't necessarily assume that he's going to come into the NBA and be able to shoot threes, but he obviously gives you elite rim protection, a guy you can throw the ball to in the post, has nice soft touch in the paint, and he's just really scratching the surface of what he can do as a player. So Donovan Clingan, a guy who there's a lot of talk that 7 is his floor, could go well beyond that. There's some talk that he might even go first, but if nothing else, a guy who Portland reportedly brought in for a private solo workout. And then you have his nemesis from the national title game, Zach Eder, who, as you surely know, an old school center who uses his size to punish opponents on both sides of the ball. Leads Purdue second most rebounds, third most points in Big Ten history. Led the NCAA in total points, rebounds in his senior season with the Boilermakers. Back-to-back winner of the Naismith, Wooden, and Abdul-Jabbar Awards. A guy who 10, 15 years ago is probably the number one pick. No one would even question it. Nowadays, with the NBA the way it is, has kind of gone away from big men. A guy who is expected to go somewhere in the first round. There was some talk early on in the process that he was going to go late in the first round. It seems more and more and more that he's moved his way up into the lottery, which is something I think you probably expect to happen in this draft. Again, is a 7'4", enormous center where the NBA is at right now? Not necessarily, but if a guy can play, he can play. And by all accounts, Zach Eder can play. 7'4", 286 pounds, once again, an absolute throwback center, back to the basket kind of guy. I saw his name mentioned with Shaq today, which Shaq doesn't get the credit he deserves. Shaq is one of the all-time greats. If Zach Eder ended up anything like Shaquille O'Neal, you don't just walk to pick him at 7th, you run to take him at 7th. And again, Shaq's a guy too where in today's NBA, if you drop Shaq into a team now in his prime, he's still going to dominate. I think that's the hope if you take a guy like Zach Eder, that with his size, he's going to be able to play well, even if the NBA is not exactly going in that direction at this point in time. Though I think we're all starting to see a little bit of a course correction in the NBA in terms of centers. You see the teams that faced off in the conference finals this year, a lot of those teams with some traditional big men centers, and that's just kind of the way the NBA works sometimes, is something is in, and then everyone does it, and then another team goes another direction, and that works, and then everyone does that. So that's just the ebb and flow of the NBA, and perhaps we're in an ebb now where the flow is about ready to come back to centers like Zach Eder. Eder reportedly had a group workout with the Trailblazers, though it was a private workout. While Donovan Clingan and Zach Eder are both very well-known properties at this point in time because of their time in college, a guy like John Salon, not so much the case. Led an 18-year-old who basically no one even knew about as of last year, has shot up draft boards in this draft process. He's played the last 2 seasons for Cholet in the French LNB Pro A League. He's a guy who at this point in time in his career really gets it done with effort, determined, tenacious defender, makes plays on and off the ball, an improving three-point shooter, shot 33% last year from Cholet after shooting basically no three-pointers the season prior to that. Also shot 77% from the free throw line. Generally, the idea is that if you can shoot free throws as a big, they feel like in the NBA they can teach you how to shoot three-pointers. Shooting 33% from 3 with Cholet already gives you a pretty good sense that while he might not ever be a knockdown shooter, going to be a guy that can hit the three-point shot with some regularity in the NBA. He ended up averaging 9 points and 4 rebounds in 33 games with Cholet. Quite a leap from his first season to his second season. 6'9", 7'1" wingspan. One of the guys in this draft who, if you're looking for more upside, if you're looking for a guy who you feel like might be a much better player than he is right now, Salon is one of those guys. There's an idea that sometimes if you just don't know a whole lot about a guy that he has a higher ceiling. That's not necessarily the case, but a guy in Salon has at least the measurables and the mentality that I think probably makes teams feel pretty good about his chance of becoming a good NBA player should they take him somewhere in the lottery. Also expected to go somewhere in the late lottery, at least the most recent mock drafts have him there. Another guy who, again, participated in that group workout with the Portland Trailblazers that was held privately, reportedly. Then there's another international, Tristan D Silva, though obviously he is a much more known product than Salon, a guy who played the last 4 seasons at Colorado, actually worked out for the Trailblazers last season in the pre-draft process before deciding to go back to Colorado. Was probably a late second-round pick then, a guy who's probably going to go anywhere in the late lottery to the mid-first round this season. Did a nice job going back to Colorado, improving his draft stock, coming back, getting his degree, and then declaring for the NBA draft this season. Stat stuffing stretch 4, a guy who shot 39% from 3 on 8 attempts his senior season. Nice little crafty finisher at the rim, can actually get out in transition, can handle the ball a little bit. A guy who can just do a little bit of everything. His three-point shooting is what's going to get him on the court in the NBA, but he has a varied game that he just does kind of those little things, very much like another guy out of Colorado, Jabari Walker. In the NBA nowadays, you almost need bigs that can shoot, and Tristan D Silva, a guy who can shoot. A little undersized for center at 6'8", 6'9", but I think a guy who could probably play some small ball center, can definitely play the 3 or the 4. A very underrated defender as well, too, a very good positional defender. Tristan D Silva, one of those guys who, his ceiling might not be as high as some other guys, but if you end up drafting him, I feel like you feel very confident that he's going to have a long, productive career in the NBA. And in this draft, that might be what you're looking for. And then the other side of that coin is a guy like Kel'el Ware, who's really more of a guy who played that first season at Oregon, did not go the way that he or Ducks would like, ended up transferring to Indiana, had a great season in his 1 year at Indiana. Phenomenal athlete, great rim protection, questions about his motor, but if he's on your team and motivated, he has the skills, the size, and the athleticism to really make a difference at that center position. I think Kel'el Ware, a guy who's probably a little undervalued in this draft, a guy who some mock drafts had him going in the second round, some mock drafts had him going in the lottery. Seems like he's kind of evened out somewhere in the late lottery to late first round at this point in time. But again, in this draft, if he went 14th, that wouldn't surprise me in the slightest bit. Of all the centers that came through Portland for workouts, Ware is the guy who I think gives you a little bit of everything. He's a much better shooter than guys like Klingon and Eder, much larger than a guy like De Silva. And again, a guy who, where you just look at him and you watch him play, you can just absolutely see the way that he would work on an NBA court, the absolute kind of guy you want as a center in the modern NBA. And again, someone who, because of the way things went at the beginning of his career, maybe a little bit undervalued. A lot of times when it comes to big men, the concerns about motor, I think, are a bit overblown. You know, when you are a big man, it's tough. You know, you're getting banged on nonstop. So, like, it's a little different than when you're a guard. You don't get the ball as often as the other guys do. So you don't get the chance to score as often as they do to keep you engaged. But I feel like a lot of times, you know, that's a product of kind of just youth. And once you get into an NBA system, once you're a professional, I feel like a lot of those things generally get taken care of. And again, Ware did have a workout with the Trailblazers, a public workout with the Trailblazers that also featured Tyler Smith out of the G League Ignite, another guy who I think they might be considering at that 4 or 5 position. Also Kai Filipowski out of Duke, a guy who projecting more as a power forward in the NBA, another guy, great three-point shooter for his size, came through Portland for a public workout as well. He was in the Tristan D Silva workout actually as well, a guy who I think absolutely could be in play for the Portland Trailblazers at 14. And then in regards to the second round, again, as I mentioned, a bit difficult to project out into the second round, particularly when you have players come into Portland, because sometimes you don't know if necessarily they brought a player in because they like that player, or they brought a player in because they want to see someone with those skills go up against a player that they like more. That's kind of the way that some of these workouts work, is that a lot of times you maybe have 1 or 2 guys in the workout that you like, and then you're bringing in players to try to test the deficiencies you feel like those players might have. Now, granted, you might watch those players during that workout and decide, hey, we actually maybe like this guy better than the guy we thought we were going to like, but it just makes it a little more difficult when you're talking about second round picks and interest, because a lot of these guys are going through so many workouts. A lot of times it's just about getting guys into your building to get 6 players so you can have a run. So it's a little difficult to tell once you get that far back into the draft what the actual interest is among the teams. But I would say that guys like Adem Bona out of UCLA, Oso Ighodaro out of Marquette, Dylan Jones out of Weber State, and Nikola Durisic out of KK Mega Basket Belgrade, and Naquan Tomlin out of Memphis are players who worked out for the Trailblazers in Portland, who they might be considering for their 34th and 40th picks. That's just a straight up gut feeling on my behalf. I don't have any intel about any of those things. No one in the front office generally tells me anything about any of their opinions when it comes to the draft, at least prior to the draft. So seeing some of the players who have come through Portland, seeing where those players ended up going after they went to Portland, seeing some of the skills that those players might have, and then figuring out, are these generally the kind of players that Portland selects in the second round? The fact that those players all worked out for the Trailblazers, the best indication that they're at least somewhat interested in bringing those players in. All those guys expected to go somewhere in the second round. So I'm just making an assumption there that the players that they like, that they brought in, who are also projected in the second round, are likely players they are considering in the second round. And that's going to do it for this edition of The Briefcase, episode 100 of The Briefcase. Thank you so much for joining me, as always. First round is on Wednesday, 5 o'clock on ESPN. Second round is on Thursday, 1 o'clock, also on ESPN. Go to trailblazers.com/draft. If you want to come to our draft party, it's free admission at Moda Center. 5 o'clock start time for that one. Games, prizes, celebrate whoever the Trailblazers end up selecting in the draft. And then I think we'll probably have press conferences with the new players on Saturday, so be on the lookout for that. But plenty of draft coverage this week leading up to and after the 2024 NBA draft. So we will talk to you later on this week. Thanks so much for joining me as always. I am Casey Holdahl. Go Blazers.